So, Jennifer, where are you from? I read you're from a small place in Australia.
Yeah, that's right. I'm from a town called Armidale, which is in northern New South Wales in Australia.
Oh, okay. I'm from Australia too. So.
I thought I recognised the accent. What part are you from?
Near Newcastle, about 30 minutes outside of Newcastle, near the coast.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so I'm a bit further north than that. 100 kilometres north of Tamworth, the country music capital of Australia.
Ah, very good. And when you were a child, what did you want to be when you grew up?
Oh, it went through many phases. For a while there I wanted to be a vet, but it all really came into place when I was watching television, and I had this image that I wanted to be an opera singer, even though I didn't really know what opera was, and I didn't really know what it entailed. I didn't understand it. I was excited by opera, and I remember watching operas on television with Dame Joan Sutherland in them and loving it. And so I had this fascination with music and performing.
And how did you find the Alexander technique?
Well, I was back in Australia. I was playing recorder and noticed a little bit of sort of pain and tension in my arms when I played. And I remember getting a book out of the library about the Alexander technique. I couldn't tell you which book it was. It's too long ago. But then I didn't really think about it again until I was in Bristol in the UK doing my PhD in drama. And I was I was typing my thesis and doing research, so lots of computer work. And my main hobbies were playing my recorder and knitting and cooking. So lots of hand-intensive activities there. And I started getting pain in my arms, first in my right arm and then in my left arm. And it didn't go away, no matter where I went. So I tried the doctor, and the doctor wanted to inject me with steroids, and I didn't really like the sound of that. And I tried physiotherapy, I tried going to the osteopath, but nothing really made it go away. And so I then tried the Alexander technique. I found a leaflet for a teacher in Bristol, and at that point the discomfort started to go away. So that was how I found it.
And what caused you to want to train to become a teacher of Alexander?
I found what I was learning in the lessons so fascinating and so helpful that I wanted to know more about it. And also I had this sense that the knowledge that I was gaining was so useful that actually I wanted to be a part of helping other people to gain the benefits that I had gained. And so I started my training in 2003, actually. It was September 2003.
My impression is that female teachers tend to outnumber male teachers in the Alexander technique by about 2 to 1. Is that what you see?
I'm not sure. Do you know, I've never really looked at the figures. I've never really looked out in the world. Certainly within Bristol, there's quite a large Alexander technique population in Bristol. And I don't think the figures were quite that stark in Bristol. I think... Ooh, getting a lot of static there. That's better. That was exciting. Yeah, I get the impression in Bristol that there are still more female teachers, but we also have a fair number of male teachers who are very good.
Do you find yourself teaching differently to men than to women?
I find myself teaching differently according to the personality of the person. It doesn't matter whether they're male or female. I will adjust my teaching style to suit the personality and the character of the person who is in the room with me.
And so what are some of the major adjustments that you make to different personalities in teaching the technique?
Oh gosh. Well, it entirely depends on the person. If I have someone in the room who is very nervous, for example, I'm not going to be quite so I might not be quite so out there with the jokes I use. For example, I might be a little bit more careful about the way I phrase things. Oh gosh, if I'm teaching teenagers, I tend to be a little bit more outgoing, I suppose. I teach groups of teenagers at an acting school, and they tend to have quite large personalities, so that enables me to enlarge my personality to match their experience, to reflect back their experience a little bit. It means that I can use that to mould their thinking in an indirect way.
Tell me about your teacher training program in Bristol.
Sorry, I missed half of that question.
Tell me about your teacher training program.
Okay. Well, there are actually 2 teacher training programs in Bristol. I don't know if you knew that. So there is the one that I came from is called the interactive teaching method for the teaching of the Alexander technique, and it is run by a man called Don Weed, who was trained by Marjorie Barstow.
So tell me more about that style.
Okay. Well, it's part of the Nebraska lineage. How can I describe what we do? We take Alexander's books very seriously, and a lot of our training course, there are significant parts of our training course that are devoted to in-depth studies of approximately half of Alexander's writing. And we develop a very great appreciation. Yeah, well, as the name suggests, we are interactive. Basically, that means that we ask a lot of questions. A lot of our teaching style is question and answer. We work with people a lot in activities. So if someone's having problems with a particular activity, we're very happy to work with them in that activity, whatever that may be. So I've given lessons to people doing all sorts of activities. Everything from getting out of a chair to yoga to running to using a sewing machine, juggling, all sorts of things. And yeah, so on the one hand, we have a very strong textual-based focus on Alexander's work and going back to the books, and on the other hand, we work very much in an interactive fashion, working with the student where they are, trying to work from the student's understandings and experience to further them on their Alexander journey. So we're not expecting them to meet us, we're going to meet them and take them on the journey. And we also do a reasonable amount of group teaching. not to say that we don't teach one-to-one, but we very often have a group teaching focus.
Tell me about discovering that there are many different schools of Alexander technique, and sometimes have fairly testy relationships with each other. Is that what you expected, or how was that?
I mean, there's definitely 4 different schools of Alexander technique in the UK, and I'm part of the professional what's it called? It's called ATPAF. It's the Professional Associations Forum, and I'm one of the interactive teaching method representatives on that forum, where all of the different professional associations within Britain come together, and we're talking about really interesting things like core curriculum. What is it that makes the Alexander technique in this country for regulatory purposes? It's certainly true that the different professional associations have not always seen eye to eye, which is perfectly understandable. I don't think there's any profession in the world where everyone sees eye to eye and everyone agrees and everything's absolutely happy. I'm also enjoying getting out there in the world of the interwebs, so to speak, and meeting teachers from all over the world with different perspectives and having a chat with them, reading their blogs, commenting, having them comment online. It's a very interesting way to find out what people think and to learn from them.
So it was never disconcerting to you to learn about these different approaches to the technique?
No, not disconcerting, no. I find it's always fascinating to discover people who don't believe the same things as you, or who don't necessarily think in the same way as you, because what they think may well be fascinating. There may well be something of the way they think about the work which is valuable and useful, but you won't know unless you go out there and talk to them.
So how is the Alexander technique perceived in England? Is it fairly well known, or are most people ignorant of it?
I think that in the UK, I would say that we follow what F.M. Alexander wrote in his books, actually. I think it's in Man's Supreme Inheritance. He said that the number of people interested in his work would be less than 1 in 100. I think he was probably right about that. There's certainly an understanding of that the Alexander technique exists within certain specific activity groups, such as the performing arts. But if I went down to my local railway station and grabbed the first 100 people off the train at 8:30 in the morning and said, "Have you heard of the Alexander technique?" I don't know how many of them would have. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah. I assume you've traveled. I assume you, in addition to spending time in England and Australia, do you notice anything different about, say, the British attitude to Alexander technique than what you've encountered elsewhere? I don't think I've travelled enough to be able to answer that question, to be absolutely truthful with you. I think you'd need to ask someone else about that. Okay. So, was there a moment when you realized that you'd be devoting much of your life to teaching Alexander technique?
Oh, I think once I really got into the training course and really understood just how endlessly fascinating it was, then I realised that it was going to be more than a passing fancy. It was something that I really did want to teach as close to full time as I could, given the circumstances I was in. I mean, when I started the training course, I was already pregnant with my son. So I did the training course while pregnant and with a baby.
Wow.
Yeah, that was exciting.
How did you manage to make a go of it as a teacher once you graduated?
Oh, well, to start with, frankly, I didn't. Because I had a very young son, so I had very, very limited amounts of time that I could devote to anything very much. And I think sometimes when trainees leave their training course, they don't realise quite how much work it's going to take to really set up a practice, to set up a business. Let's face it, it's a business. And how much work that's going to take in order to build a client base, in order to build the structures that you need to be able to effectively look after that client base. Because all of that really does take time and it takes thought. And so it took me a little while, I think, to fully understand how much work I was going to have to put in, and then to have the time to be able to do that and do it effectively.
So how did you get your clients?
Well, it took me a long time thinking about it now. It took me a fair while, a couple of years maybe, to realise that although in theory I could teach everyone, in practice you can't teach everyone. Because you simply can't just broadcast to the world, here I am, and expect people to come, because they don't. It took me a while to realise, well, there are certain groups of people that I like to work with, so how about I target my message to those people? There's, a friend of mine, a colleague of mine, put it this way, if you're vanilla ice cream, then you want to talk to the other people who like vanilla ice cream. If you're chocolate chip ice cream, then you want to speak to the people who also like chocolate chip ice cream. And the person who likes chocolate chip might not like vanilla. So you need to focus yourself on a particular group of people. And my thinking in that was really helped by reading blogs by a man called Mark Silver, who has a website called Heart of Business, and he talks about there being 3 journeys of marketing, and very much what he's talking about is the idea that, well, you can't speak to everyone effectively. You can speak to a certain group of people and speak to them really well. And so once I started doing that, then my client base started improving.
So which niches did you target?
Well, what I realised was that when you think about it, it sounds obvious, but because my background was in music and theatre, that actually, even though that's a very standard market for Alexander teachers to approach, well, it's the market I know best. They're the people I know best. I speak that language quite well, so I started talking to those people, or thinking about those people when I write, or when I put ads out there, and that really helps. And also people who have had problems with RSI, just because I know exactly what that's like, because that's where I was.
Yeah. So, did you develop your teaching style, or is it pretty much what you were taught in your training school, or did you need to start adapting your teaching to make a go of it in the real world?
Within my training course, we're given a fantastic set of principles and a fantastic structure for lessons and for how to think about the work and how to think about progressing a student along their journey to what we call a complete Alexander education, whatever that may be for each teacher. But the point is, each one of us has to decide what that is and what that would look like. And let's face it, I'm different to my colleagues. So, all of us is a different person. So we're all going to have a different personality. We're all going to have a different flavour. We're going to speak about the same things, but we're going to be using slightly different language in the way we do it. And I think that's the other thing, is it takes time to become comfortable within yourself, I think. When you first start teaching, I can't speak for my colleagues, I suppose, but certainly when I first started teaching, I was scared as heck, because, you're afraid of saying the wrong thing, you're afraid of getting things wrong. And it takes a little bit of time to realise that the world isn't going to end.
Yeah.
And that actually everything's fine, and you can cope with pretty much anything, and it's, and if things go wrong, well, it's not the end of the world. There's always another day. It takes time to be comfortable within your own skin.
Yeah. So did you find any differences between what you wanted your students to learn and what your students wanted to learn?
Oh, I think that's inevitable. I think that's inevitable. Most students, when they walk through the door, want to be given things to do to make whatever it is that hurts stop hurting. What I want to do is teach them the Alexander technique, which happens to give them the tools that will help them to stop doing the things that have caused the hurt in the first place. It's very different. Those are two different things, but it's a matter of finding the intersection point between those, or helping the student to understand that just giving them another set of things to do is not going to help them, because the chances are they're already doing far too much. And that's what caused their problem in the first place.
So do your students, how do they react when they realize how much work they're going to have to do?
I don't think they ever necessarily realise quite how much work they are doing. Silence. What do I mean by that?
Yeah.
There you go. I gave you your next question. Well, one of the things that we talk about in the interactive teaching method is that, yes, you're studying the technique, but we say the closest word in the English language to the word study is the word fun. So it's not about doing something that is difficult or hard or slow. What we're doing is fun. And we have a lot of fun, and we have a lot of laughter in lessons, because if someone's laughing, the chances are they're going to be in a more receptive frame of mind and more able to learn. So even though my students probably are doing ever such a lot of work outside of lessons, they don't see it as work. because they're having fun. They're discovering new things, they're having fun.
I was shocked early in my initial lessons when my teacher asked me, "What are you thinking about?" It's like, holy hell, what am I thinking about? You want me to tell you what I'm thinking about? I mean, and it was not my directions. So that was kind of shocking to me, that if you think your directions, it actually makes a difference in how you do things.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I've been talking to my students about recently is this idea of practice. And what I've been talking about is, particularly because I'm working with actors a fair bit at the moment, and singers, I talk about Dame Nellie Melba, the Australian soprano, at the turn of the 20th century. And she wrote a wonderful set of articles about singing and with practice with regard to singing. And she said that the maximum that someone should practice, actual physical singing practice in a day, if you're a beginner, is 10 minutes. And I think sometimes we have this very heavy idea of what it means to do practice, and we think that putting in the hours is a really good thing. Well, actually, what if it's not the quantity that we do, it's the quality of it? What if you spend only 5 minutes, but it's a seriously good 5 minutes? What would that do? What would a seriously good 5 minutes thinking about your directions do? Even if you only do that once a day, would it be the case that actually increasingly it would become difficult to stop after 5 minutes?
Do you find yourself having conflicts with students who want to take charge of the lesson, or who think they know better than you about how to teach the lesson?
No, not really. I think it is true to say, I mean, Alexander talks about this in the chapter in Correct Conception, doesn't he? He talks about the fact that every student has their own, no matter what the teacher says, the student will hear it in accordance with their own preconceived ideas. So no matter what you say, the student's going to take it in a way which fits in with their worldview and their paradigm. I can't remember the last time. No, I can't remember ever having got into a situation with a student where we just ended up at loggerheads.
Well, I better not get too autobiographical there.
Why, have you had such an experience?
Yes.
Really? Tell me about it.
Oh, well, they say, of one student, he calls me by my Hebrew name, and he says, yes, Levi, but I want to do this. And I don't know, we're like constantly at loggerheads, and I think maybe it's because he's a friend and I gave him such a deeply discounted lesson, and then he can take seriously what I'm trying to teach him. I think there's a couple of things to be said about that. One of them is I learned very early on that I shouldn't teach friends. Just because because friendship is a very different transaction to a teacher-student transaction. It's just a very different relationship, and some people don't make the transition so easily, I think. Yeah.
And the other thing is I also learned very early on, and actually I was given a fantastic piece of advice by another experienced teacher. He said, don't do cut price lessons. They're either full price or they're free. If someone walks through the door and they really can't afford it, then just give it to them for free. But otherwise, it's full price. Because when you cut the price of the lesson, what you're saying is you're giving that clue that you don't need to take it quite so seriously because you're not paying very much for it, I think.
Exactly.
And let's face it, we are professionals. We are professionals dealing with psychophysical unity. We have undergone training. We know what we're doing.
Yes. Please tell my student that. I was quite impressed from reading your blog that you're able to give lessons to your husband. It seems to me that most Alexander teachers are not able to work with family members.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I think, again, it's one of those things where you need to make sure there's clarity within the transaction, I guess. So and again, my son will periodically ask for a lesson, and when he's had enough, he says stop, and at that point I have to stop.
Yeah.
If he's had enough, then I stop. I certainly wouldn't just. I would try and make it my policy to not to abuse my husband's goodwill by trying to give him a lesson when he was not interested. If that makes sense.
Yeah. It's made me think when I read that you're able to give lessons to your husband, and I know other teachers who are able to give lessons to their spouse, and the lessons actually make a difference. And it just made me wonder in what type of relationships are we open to learning something from our partner or spouse, and what type of relationships are we not open to learning something from our partner or spouse? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I think it really is about clarity of transaction and saying, this is, sometimes my husband will say something like, my back's really sore or my neck's really sore. So I'll say, well, I can see that there's something that I could do to help that, which if you want me to help you with that, then just tell me. Because then it's up to him to decide whether he wants that or whether he was just saying, oh, this really hurts, and what he really wants me to say is, oh, that's really sad, I'm sorry for you.
Yeah.
So it's about not assuming that someone else wants your expertise just because you happen to have it.
I struggle with not telling my students that they're wrong. Like, how do you go about improving or correcting or pointing things out to your students where they're doing things that are not serving them? How do you go about that?
Well, nobody likes to be wrong. I think that's the thing to remember is nobody likes to be wrong. So I try to be very careful about not saying things in such a way that says, you're wrong. And one of the ways that I use, and it's certainly a part of the interactive teaching method as a whole, is that we will try to say things in a way that is non-threatening. And one of the great ways of doing that is making a joke. So if I have a student who, for one reason or another, refuses to allow me to move their head, just to do passive movements of their head, what I will say is, somebody, I don't know who, somebody seems to have an idea about what they can do with their head. and make a little joke about it. Because if you use language like that, somebody, I don't know who, but somebody in this room, it just makes things a little bit lighter, and it means that they can buy into that joke because you're separating it out. You're not saying you don't like moving your head. You won't let me move your head. It's a very different interaction.
Well, what's wrong with you,
Yeah. Why aren't you doing that? Yeah. So I don't want to. Obviously, you don't want to upset your student. You don't want to be. You want them to be in an open and receptive frame of mind, so that they're in the best position for learning. Obviously, so any way that you can take the pressure out of the situation for them is a good thing. And how many students will try and do things in order to avoid being wrong, or even more strongly, to be right? Well, if you read Alexander, he'll say that's pretty much everyone.
Yeah. I've never heard of the interactive teaching method for Alexander technique. I've certainly heard of the large master approach. So I'm wondering, is the interactive method that you're trained in, is that unique to Don Weed's school, using the name?
Yeah, it was created by Don. There are teachers, he trains now in Bristol, but there are teachers trained in the interactive teaching method, teaching in the UK, Ireland, Switzerland, Germany. We have one teacher in Canada, and other European countries as well. But those are the main ones.
So what led you to start blogging?
I started blogging because of, again, I was talking about Mark Silver and the Heart of Business. I did a marketing course, and one of the things he talks about is this idea of the 3 journeys of marketing. And most small businesses put all of their time into the first journey, and the first journey is purely and simply first contact. So someone has a sore back, and they have heard of Alexander Technique, and they look up Alexander Technique on Google, and they find your website. Fantastic. They take a look at your website. That's first contact. Or they find a leaflet in the local cafe. That's first contact. And most people don't have anything else. But what Mark Silver talks about is this idea, well, someone might not feel comfortable with just ringing you up. They might want to know a bit more about you. If it's a problem that they feel worried about or concerned about, or if it's something that's very personal to them, they'll want to know more about you before they're prepared to trust you. And so the more information that you've got out there that they can access, the more comfortable they will be with you. And so that's why I started blogging, because I realised that actually I didn't have anything out there to help people feel comfortable with me before they felt able to ring me up even. So I started writing my blog.
So what have you discovered from the process of writing your blog?
Oh, it's been tremendously beneficial. Just the act of sitting down and writing something every week is a fantastic discipline, because it encouraged me to be more regular in my reading of Alexander's books. It encourages me to really think about some of the issues that my students are having. So if someone comes in who's got a particular problem, the most recent one with fatigue, I had a couple of students who had very definite fatigue reactions to lessons, and I started thinking about why that was. And it was the act of thinking about it and then writing about it made that whole issue more clear for me. So if you commit to writing, you clarify your own thinking, and actually you learn something in the act of writing. So I've learned so much about the technique just from the act of writing that purely for that reason I think it's incredibly beneficial. Also, it's great for my students because everyone has a break from lessons occasionally, but it means that they can keep up with the ideas, and periodically someone will send an email out of the blue, or they'll ring up and book up a lesson, and they'll say to me, "Oh, I've been reading your blog. You know, this really helped me this week," and it's just really lovely to have that.
So how do you like Alexander's books? How do you like reading them?
Oh, I love them. I think they're marvellous. I know some people find them difficult, and that's because actually, you know, they are. They're not airport novels. But on the other hand, when you're dealing with ideas as significant and occasionally complex as what Alexander talks about, I don't see that he could write about them in any other way. And certainly that was what he wrote about in the opening of Universal Constant in Living. You know, he writes about the fact that people complained about the length of his sentences, and a couple of his friends tried to rewrite his sentences more simply and realized that they couldn't contain all of the ideas that were in longer sentences in shorter ones. So there is a reason why Alexander writes in the way he does. And I just love reading them. I really do. There are certain chapters that are just absolutely brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. They tell you everything you need to know about what a lesson is about, what students will think, what they'll say. You know, it's all there. It's all there if you read it.
Do you ever think about the effects of F.M. Alexander's foibles upon the Alexander Technique teaching profession?
In what way?
Oh gosh, he was such a deeply flawed man. I could start elaborating, if you'd like.
Yeah, what flaws, what do you mean? Yeah, go on.
Well, let's take plagiarism. I'm not an expert on F.M. Alexander, but according to probably the person who spent the most time unearthing original documents and doing investigations on F.M. Alexander, Jerome Staring in the Netherlands, it seems that F.M. Alexander took almost everything that is now known as the Alexander Technique from other sources that was not credited.
That's interesting. Yeah, go on.
Oh, so another thing that strikes me about the connection that I see, but many other people don't, between F.M. Alexander the man and the Alexander Technique teaching profession is insecurity. F.M. Alexander is somebody who completely obliterated his past. He took on an upper-class British accent. He would make almost no mention of his family or his Australian origins. He was both very eager for the medical profession to take note, for the scientists to take note of what he was doing, but at the same time, he really didn't want any scientific investigation of his work, and so I see that carrying on into the history of the Alexander Technique teaching profession. It's only maybe recently with the British medical journal starting to have a truly scientific covered line studying of the Alexander Technique. So until then, the professions had a very kind of varied relationship with any outside investigation of its claims.
Okay. Alexander and his foibles. I don't know enough about the man to be able to speak to anything directly, but I think what I can say is that he was human, and I think we all have foibles. And actually that doesn't worry me so much, because if you read the books, the principles of the work are good. And they work. What more can you ask? The principles are good and they work.
Okay, great. What do you see as the Alexander technique's relationship with the medical profession?
Oh, in what way? How do you mean?
Well, I don't know if you're familiar with, I think it's Jennifer Tarr. She's a sociologist at the London School of Economics who wrote a sociological analysis of Alexander teachers.
Oh, right. No, I don't know that.
And she noticed, for instance, that the trainees that she encountered were drawn to Alexander technique because they saw it as alternative medicine, while the teachers were much more eager to classify it as complementary medicine. So trainees thought it, saw it as, substituting or as a, totally different thing than regular medicine, and they were kind of, frustrated with Western medicine, and that's one of the reasons they got into what they thought of as kind of alternative medicine, the Alexander technique. But while the teachers and the training schools were much more eager to be complementary to Western medicine. So that was one interesting observation. She had many interesting observations. Another one was that there tends to be a cult of F.M. Alexander, and this stops the Alexander technique from being taken seriously in the medical profession. And that he roots, F.M. Alexander roots his technique in basically racism and what's that thing where you have inherited characteristics? I'm getting the exact word for that. But she says that that like the literature, F.M. Alexander's books make it very difficult for scientists or for doctors to accept it. That therefore the technique is going to be inherently limited in the respect that it receives from the medical and scientific community. Those are her arguments.
Okay. I know that in the past, Alexander's books, he has been accused of believing in eugenics.
Yes.
Is that the term you were looking for?
Yeah.
I don't think that holds up under the basis of the text, personally. Also, you've got to understand when he was writing the books. He was, particularly the first one, Man's Supreme Inheritance, it was 1910, it's very early, and a lot of what he writes about isn't based in Darwinian evolution, it's based in Lamarckian evolution, which is a very different model. And so as you read sections talking about evolution, it's advisable to remember that what he means by evolution might not necessarily be exactly the same term that we would mean. So just to say that as an aside. As far as the relationship between Alexander technique and medicine, I have a very simple view on that, where what I do isn't medicine and it's not related to medicine. It's just not. The Alexander technique doesn't cure anything. We don't. That's not what we deal with. What we deal with is problems caused by people's manner of use of themselves. If people's back pain goes away as a result of that, then that's fantastic. But what we're dealing with is their manner of use of themselves. We're not dealing with anything that is structural or physiologic at all, as far as I'm concerned.
Do doctors refer patients to you?
Yes.
So you do have a relationship with the medical profession, and one that seems to be working quite nicely.
Doctors, well, in this country, the Alexander technique is now a profession that is listed, has a register on a website run by the Complementary and Natural Healthcare Council, and I'm a member of that. So it's a set of disciplines, of which there are many on this register, and all doctors have access to a copy of the database of people who are on this register. Basically, it means that if you come from a recognised Alexander technique training school, if you have a recognised qualification, then you can apply to become part of this register, part of this organisation. So in that sense, yeah, there's a relationship. I had a student come to me this morning who had been told by his doctor that he ought to investigate Alexander technique, because the doctor took one look at him and said, "Oh gosh, you're not standing. I think the problem in your neck's caused by the way you're standing."
Wow.
I don't know how many doctors out there would say something like that to a student. Clearly some do.
Have you gotten out there and spoken to doctors about the technique and noticed any difference in the way they related to the technique from regular people?
No, I haven't. No, a couple of my colleagues have. They've done presentations to doctor surgeries as part of their training time that they have each week. But I haven't personally known, so I couldn't speak to attitudes within the medical profession in the UK.
What are the biggest challenges that you face as a teacher of the Alexander technique?
Oh. That's a really difficult question. Finding the time to do everything. Finding the time to read the books, because reading the books is useful and helpful and beneficial. To teach the lessons, to write up the lessons in a lesson log, to maintain a student database, to write the blog, keep the website updated, to create new courses and new materials, and to do the work necessary to look after my students. So to find articles and other blogs, other things that would be interesting to them, and to get those out there. I think finding the time to do all of that effectively is my biggest challenge.
I'm thinking.
Why, what do you think is the biggest challenge? I'm curious to know.
Oh, for me, it's just getting students.
And I think most of the profession is going to say that. Yeah. For me, it's slightly different, just purely because of my life circumstances. I can't work any more than part-time anyway. And so for me, a full teaching load is actually, for someone else, might look small, but that's because of where I am in my, in my life circumstances. I've got a son at school, so there's only a certain amount of time I can devote each day to actual, face-to-face student interaction.
Do you ever get bored teaching the technique?
Oh, no, never. No, every person who walks through the door is endlessly fascinating, because every person has their own... I'm going to use a phrase directly from F.M. Alexander. Every person who walks through the door demonstrates the peculiarities of their own psychophysical makeup.
Yes.
By which I mean every person is completely different. They have their own private universe. They've got their own ideas and beliefs about what is right and what is true. And that is endlessly fascinating to me. And finding a way of interacting with that person in the way that is going to be most helpful and beneficial to them is endlessly fascinating.
What about your peers? I know that some of my peers have to battle with boredom. I don't know if any of your peers confess that, or if you notice that.
I can safely say I have never heard a teacher from the interactive teaching method complain of boredom, ever.
Yeah.
We're too busy having fun.
Maybe it's that interactive thing that you guys do, because, I know some teachers who do get bored, have been bored, have taken lessons from teachers who are clearly bored with what they're doing, and it's because they're doing the same term over and over and over again. But maybe the interactive thing is a little different.
No, even if the activity is the same, the person is different. The way they think is different. No, I've never experienced boredom. I'm curious to know, have you been bored?
No, not yet.
Not yet.
Yeah, well, for me this is very new. I just finished my training in December.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I did have one teacher who was frequently bored, and I have one peer who confessed to me that he or she was frequently bored in teaching. And so I haven't had enough students, but this is new to me, so I'm curious how I am going to react to this teaching profession thing. I never saw myself, in this role until the last few years, and so I'm very curious what's going to happen. So yeah. So yeah, I guess you can just hear like a lot of trepidation and questions in my tone and manner as I start on my...
I can hear trepidation. No, it's a great journey. I think that's the thing, is that it's a journey, and it sounds very selfish, but within any lesson, actually, within any lesson, there are two people learning. If it's a one-to-one lesson, there are two people learning, and one of them's the student, but the other one's the teacher.
Yeah.
Those people are learning. So it's a constant process of learning and discovery.
Seems like,
and that's a fantastic journey to be on.
Seems like a pretty happy question. I mean, I think that one would feel happy when one sees progress with one student.
Oh, it's the best thing in the world. When you see someone who's really, really been struggling and been in a really difficult place, physically or emotionally, and see them improve and just blossom is one of the great privileges of life.
Have you had many students who just aren't willing to do the mental work necessary to do this technique?
I've had students who have been convinced that I've had students who have become convinced that the way that they see themselves and the work is absolutely right, and that anything else is wrong, and that's a really difficult question to answer. Ask me again.
Yes.
I'm getting tired, you can tell.
Have you had many students who were not willing to do the mental work necessary to do this technique?
Oh, I've got a better answer than the one I was going to give. FM is quoted as saying, and I'm going to have to paraphrase it, but he's quoted as having said something like, if people knew what they were letting themselves in for when they came into the room, they wouldn't come. But where else would they go? And I think there is a sense in which if people really knew what they were letting themselves in for, my goodness, they wouldn't darken my door or any other teacher. And sometimes people will get to a point where there is something that they're not prepared to let go of, and they'll go away, and they'll disappear for 6 months, a year, 2 years, and sooner or later they come back, or they don't. Either way, they're still my student. I'm still waiting.
What was the answer that you were going to give and did not?
I think it was going to be to do with the fact that, yeah, sometimes people become so convinced of what they believe. What happens in lessons throws into such stark relief the difference between what they think or clarifies for them what they believe, and they realise they're quite happy with what they believe, and so they go away. And that's okay. I'm fine with that. My job is to, at least in part, is to encourage people to think. And if I've encouraged them to think and own what they believe, then I'm happy. It may not be what I choose, but then again, I'm not them.
When people ask you how many lessons will I need, what do you say?
Oh, the classic question. I wrote a blog about this. What I will say to them is, I can teach you the fundamentals of the Alexander technique in one lesson. Everything else is refinement. I can teach you a couple of basic ideas about what the Alexander technique is in the first lesson. And that would be enough for you to go away and work on your own. But if you really want to be able to do this stuff to a point where you know what you're doing, where you're able to apply these principles, apply this toolkit of ideas to your life, then you might want to do more than one lesson. And I encourage people to do initially a course of 6, and at that point we do a reevaluation and they decide whether they're happy or whether they want to do another series.
How much chair work do you do?
We always start off sitting, again because we work through activities in the interactive teaching method. I think we're going to work a little differently to some other schools. But yeah, we always start off sitting, always.